because we do not believe it's necessary at this stage to amend the Constitution.
Grain South Africa is of the view that the current Constitution is sufficient and broad enough to enable the government to implement a just and equitable land reform in a sustainable way.
It is my submission that Section 25 need not be amended to facilitate land reform, and that it is not necessary to make the changes to the Constitution to achieve just and equitable redistribution of land.
And we are saying no to the amendment of the Constitution. We are very clear on that.
We submit that an amendment to the Constitution as proposed would not adequately respond to most of the substantive problems that have been identified, and any amendment could also possibly adversely affect many of the positive rights that are already provided for in the Constitution, the rights to redistribution, restitution, and tenure reform.
As such, we are opposed to any amendment of Section 25 to allow for expropriation of land without compensation as some kind of blanket approach where it concerns land reform.
Expropriation without compensation offers no real answers here. So, in our view, the current inquiry into the need to amend the Constitution diverts us from the need to confront the widely acknowledged policy and program failures of land reform.
So the problem is not the Constitution. The problem has been the failure to use the Constitution effectively. So our view is that there is no need to change the Constitution.
I think, Chair, to be short and sweet, in one sentence, COSATU supports empowering government to expropriate land, be it urban or be it rural, to advance land reform or provide security to millions of our citizens.
Hope of Glory Tabernacle does not agree with calls to amend Section 25 of the Constitution in order to expropriate land without compensation.
We are not opposed to expropriation. What we are opposed to is expropriation without compensation.
Amend the Constitution to explicitly provide for land nationalization.
It's the view of ITI that amendment of the Constitution is not necessary.
So the Institute asks you, and asks you in an impassioned way, it asks you to recommend no change to the Constitution.
The current legislation on expropriation and the provisions in Section 25 are sufficient to enable government or any organ of state to expropriate land and property in a manner that is outlined in Section 25.
We are of the view that the Constitution should be amended in order to allow expropriation of land without compensation.
In our view, Section 25 does not permit expropriation without compensation. The Constitution itself has to be amended accordingly.
We are saying Section 25 need to be reviewed, and we wanted to elaborate on why. And secondly, we are saying expropriate.
BLF supports the call to amend Section 25 of the Constitution so that all land in the hands of white people, or rather is returned to the hands of black people, all that land which is currently in the hands of white people. And that includes land in Orania, land in Stellenbosch, all that land.
To be clear, in terms of the present discourse on land on Section 25 of the Constitution, we are opposed to an isolated change to that section as such.
Expropriation without compensation is contrary to the established international principle of the Declaration, and South Africa is a co-signatory to the Declaration of Human Rights. Unfortunately, a change in the Constitution is futile when we still have political parties with a hidden agenda who are still adhering to outdated ideologies, lack of political will, people who are unable to implement policies, and the government who is increasing racist-based laws to get the people of South Africa apart.
The principle of submission, certainly I'm supporting amendment of the Constitution. Certainly I'm supporting that we should be able to expropriate without compensation, and we should make that clear and explicit in the Constitution.
South Africa must be honest with itself, and in the Constitution, let's talk about the practical stuff, that in the Constitution, in particular in Chapter 1, must recognize that the Khoisan is the first nation. So that's what we are asking this portfolio committee to do, and we're asking Parliament to do.
Chair, the essence of our presentation
is that we do not see a need in amending the Constitution in its present form.
Is the subject of expropriation. I've shown that the deprivation and others are permissible, are allowed, permitted, not permissible, permitted already in the Constitution.
As the Human Rights Commission, we are saying a fundamental solution to address the issue of land reform is the adoption of reasonable legislative and policy measures that can be used by government to facilitate and expedite land reform as required by Section 25, subsection 8 of the Constitution.
Expropriation without compensation cannot be justified. The Constitution does not need to be changed.
So traditional leaders support the motion to amend Section 25 of the Constitution to allow for the expropriation of land without compensation.
The position taken by the Foundation for Human Rights on whether Section 25 of the Constitution should be amended to allow for expropriation of land without compensation is reflective of the views of the management and program staff members of the Foundation for Human Rights.
Starting with the heading of amending the Constitution, our position as the Catholic Church, being a religious body, is that we are simply not competent to pronounce on whether or not an amendment to Section 25 of the Constitution is necessary in order to facilitate expropriation without compensation.
Expropriation without compensation or below market value shows disrespect for property rights as a basic human right.
When we refer to the possible detrimental effect, we say that if you tamper with the Bill of Rights and Section 25,
we need to be careful about tinkering with the Constitution. Okay, now again, it's a debate. I'm certainly of the view that we have an enabling Constitution, and if we apply it well, and we have both the political and economic will to apply it well, I think we can actually deal with the problems we have.
We don't believe that constitutional amendments are necessary to achieve meaningful land reform. We do believe that Section 25 is a sufficient framework to achieve sustainable land reform, while still maintaining confidence in South Africa's commitment to property rights, as well as fostering a growth-friendly policy environment.
Nedbank believes that the Constitution already strikes a careful and well-considered balance between the need to protect ownership and the need to ensure land reform and address the inequalities caused by our history. In our opinion, the Constitution has to date not been an impediment to the lack of progress on land reform. In our opinion, the Constitution should therefore not be used as a scapegoat for the real reason for our lack of sufficient progress on land reform.
As a point of departure, Jonga Libalele Dube Institute doesn't support expropriation without compensation, correct? As per the last page.
Sakaliga would ask of this committee not to amend the text of the Constitution to facilitate confiscation.
Chair, we submit that government should proceed with caution when considering an amendment to the Constitution to accelerate land reform, because, in our view, to focus on the Constitution as the key impediment to successful land reform is to misdiagnose the problem.
And the submission that we make is that an amendment solely for the purposes of providing legal certainty to these circumstances will not address what we say is the more fundamental problem, which is the failure of land reform to address spatial injustice and historical disposition.
We are saying, Honorable Chair, the time has come, the time is now, let us stop pontification and do the right thing. Restore the dignity of our people, restore our people's land rights, give our people land back. Amend the Constitution to correct Section 25.